Every leader has a strategy. Executing on that strategy is the challenge. If you want to learn how to effectively achieve what you've set out to accomplish, then this show is for you. Gain keen insights and listen in as leaders share their stories and challenges. Soar Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation welcome you to Leader Dialogue Radio.
Hello, everyone. I'm Duffie Dixon. Welcome to Leader Dialogue, brought to you by Soar Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. Joining me is the Chief Executive Officer of Soar Vision Group, Ben Sawyer. Also with us is the Chief Operating Officer of Soar Vision Group, Jennifer Strahan. And once again, we're so happy. Joining us for a second week in a row is Scott McIntyre. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Guidehouse. Welcome, Scott. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
So what we call this, since we get you 2 weeks in a row, we call this second time we meet as sort of a deep dive. So we covered a number of topics, and Ben's going to sort of give us a recap, but let's dive a little bit more into what we talked about. Really good conversations.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so for listeners, we had a very engaging conversation that Scott shared with us, his experiences with PwC and the carve-out organization of that ultimately became Guidehouse, and the experiences with the Baldrige journey, and how the journey in many cases is the destination. It's not really a project. And we surfaced a number of really interesting points that we want to unpack today. So one of them has to do with leadership and employee engagement, and the fact that you can't manage quality and or people by fiat, that there is a shared responsibility, that essentially leaders have authority in their role, but responsibility is shared with the front line.
And what we learned after you said fiat, we won't say what we thought it was. Okay, I'll say what I thought it was. I thought it was the car. Okay, now I just want to say I scored very highly on my verbal SAT, but apparently there's a word I don't know. So for the listeners like me, fiat is basically the word for ruling like you are the king of the land and everyone else is your subjects. I will be using that in Scrabble.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go. So thanks for that clarification. And then the other, which was really important, and we want to unpack this with you, Scott, is this notion that what really matters from a quality standpoint is what matters to the customer as they define it, and that is not always easy to elicit. That you can't just assume that they want good service, responsive processes and even continuity of people, but it's how do you really understand and find out what they want, and then make sure that your strategy, your operations, and so on are all aligned, and that becomes the essence of the quality program. So, thoughts on that, Scott? Does that summarize reasonably well what we talked about last week?
Absolutely. Looking forward to diving into both of those.
Okay. So what I wanted to start off for the listeners, there's a really interesting article that was published in the March 2015 issue of Harvard Business Review. It is called Why Strategy Unravels and What to Do About It. The authors are Donald Soll, who got his PhD at MIT, and Rebecca Homkes, who's a researcher at the London School of Economics. And also a gentleman by the name of Charles Soll was a co-author.
So it sounds like they wrote about my life.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So what they did, they had a sample of, let's see here, 8,000 managers in more than 250 companies over an 8-year period. And they surveyed tests to 7,600 managers. So it was really interesting. And one of the myths, actually myth 3 in the article, is that communication equals understanding. So talking about the challenges of leadership and connecting with the front line, many leaders, and they talk about this, will have town hall meetings and other kinds of discussions, and they assume that it is then understood and applied. And that, in fact, is a myth.
Also like parenting.
Very much like parenting. You had to bring that up. Thank you. Yeah. And then another myth that actually has to do with customer delivery and sustainability is execution means sticking to the plan. And they state in their article, which I always chuckle when I hear, is there's never been a Gantt chart that survived reality.
Right.
Ever. Right. And so what that means, and you talked about this last time, Scott, so I want to lateral to you, is that you have to fundamentally have good people that are empowered to act like an owner, right, to be able to actually make the strategy happen. And as leaders, you have to take the time not just to communicate, but to whatever it takes to make sure that there's engagement. So can you, if I can lateral that to you, Scott, can you just help us unpack that?
Yeah, you bet, Ben. I mean, you could have several shows on just these two topics alone. They're both really important. It's interesting when you think about how do you get people to act like owners,
right?
And there's various ways to do that, and some of those ways actually involve equity, right? But
right.
The reality is, even equity owners don't always act like owners in the context of what we're trying to achieve as leaders.
Right.
You make decisions, you collaborate, you participate, you contribute in a way that moves the organization forward, not like a social experiment, but like a business that is passionate about success and also passionate about serving its clients and customers regardless of where they are. So the thing that I take away from this, and I think about our journey, and I think about the business that Guidehouse is and has become, and I'll tell you, this is not something that I've ever put down as sort of from our playbook as a measurable item, but the thing that comes about in our culture over and over again is that innovation or some spectacular piece of customer client service or an incredibly persuasive deliverable if we're doing a consulting project, they come up from the organization and they're not driven from the top. They're coming from people who are engaged with their clients, passionate about their clients' missions, caring about their clients' success. They have the fortitude to bring the best of what my company Guidehouse has in terms of intellectual property and analytical capacity to their clients' needs. And it's the difference between being a top-down, C-suite driven business and being a line-led business. And despite being the CEO of Guidehouse, we see ourselves as a line-led business. We see ourselves as a business, and it does tie back to what you said a moment ago about putting the customer at the center of things. We're very focused, I think in some cases obsessed with making sure that there's no light getting between the customer and the people who are serving those customers. And that means bureaucracy isn't getting in the way, policy and rulemaking aren't getting in the way, second guessing isn't disturbing things. And that is, I'm sure there are a lot of academic and professional standards and studies that would suggest great ways to measure engagement, measure how you get close to your customer. But I have a palpable sense beyond what we do measure that when I'm seeing anecdotal evidence that our people are over-delivering for their clients and engaged in their clients' success, I mean that's regardless of what industry you're in or how you serve a customer, that's like utopia. And it does begin, as trite as this is, it begins by hiring great people and giving them purpose. And I know, by the way, your first point on communication doesn't equal understanding. That's where you have people with purpose, you have people with passion, they're intellectually capable, and now how do you get them moving in the direction that your strategy calls for? And you're right, it's not just about communication. I have some thoughts on that, by the way.
Yeah. So I want to get into that. One of the things that I want to repeat, because it was so important what you said, you can't really let any light between the customer and the front line occur, otherwise you miss performance opportunities. So that has significant implications for leadership. And you implied this concept of servant leadership in what you just said, Scott, where as a senior leader, you're mostly concerned about making sure that doesn't happen, that there's light between, and that the frontline associates are empowered to innovate and so forth, which is very different from top-down directives. Can you just comment on that a little bit? Because I thought that comment was intriguing.
Yeah, I'd love to, and a couple of thoughts on that, and I think it's really important. First of all, we all know if we're wearing a hat that's primarily concerned about enterprise risk management, litigation, risk exposure, you're going to have a C-suite bureaucratic-led business, and bureaucratic always sounds bad, but in this hypothetical, it's exactly what's necessary.
Right.
But the reality is none of us live or can live for long in a world of complete risk aversion. So you have to balance that, right? And some companies and organizations, and no one's immune from this, they ebb and flow between sort of the risk, the tolerance extremes. But the reality is when you have a business, and you can have this in any industry, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, consulting, professional services, when you have people who are really motivated And, I don't like the phrase all, moving in the same direction, because I'm not even sure what that means, but They generally have a shared commitment to the values of the organization and the mission we're trying to achieve, and that gets translated into their daily activities.
Right.
You don't need to have a lot of bureaucracy. You
Right.
do need policies. You do need internal controls. But I'll give you an example, and I'll obfuscate the details of something that illustrates this point, and just happened recently here. We had a situation where a client wanted us to have an operation overseas, and there's some proclivities associated with setting up that operation.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't really in our best interest, and we're not even sure we could serve the client in the capacity they desired, the way they were structuring it. We didn't have a team that serves that client have to go up a chain of bureaucracy to seek approvals or to help with risk mitigation. We had a team that was self-actualized and knowledgeable enough to work with the client on their own to find the right path forward. And there's myriad examples where the institution is set up to take the input from the market and then drive it up a bureaucracy, where at best, you're lethargic in your reaction to the market, where at worst you kill the deal either through the commitment of time it takes to get something done, or you've loaded it up with so much risk management you can't maneuver. And that's I think it's really important to have an organization where there is no daylight between the client and the line, but that is not the same thing as having sort of the line and the people who are working with clients and customers every day act like cowboys and have a free-for-all.
Correct.
When you have the magic, you've got people who are independent thinkers, they're disciplined, they understand the operating tolerance, what we call at Guidehouse the guideposts of the organization.
Yep.
And with that understanding doesn't come perfection, but comes a lot of agility, and comes the perception that that the clients do come first. They're at the center of the model.
So success is messy, right? I mean, you don't just jump into success because you're following some very simple, straightforward approach. How big is this relative to the successes you've had both at PwC and now? This concept.
And sorry, Ben, when you say how big is this, what you're referring to?
This being able to get to shared commitment, self-actualization, not getting daylight between customers in the front line, but also not cowboys. Thank
you. I'll go back to what you said a moment ago, that communication is not understanding. It's really important, because when you're constantly working with people, it does begin with communication, but it also means a lot of listening and a lot of course correction. When you're working with people who are, as we just discussed, so engaged in the mission and so engaged in the company, like everything else becomes a lot easier.
Yeah.
Right? And everything else could be purely pedestrian or routine things, like we've got to work this weekend on a client deliverable, a client matter, or we're going to make this investment and I need to move you from one part of the organization to another. People are much more adaptable to short-term and long-term change. They're much more eager to take on new challenges when they really understand where the organization's going and what their role is in it.
Right.
One of the things this reminds me of is there's a book. This is for Duffie.
She always, just so you know, Scott, Jennifer, I always want her to make a book recommendation. So here it comes.
This is a book that came out. It's called The Amazon Way. It's not a new book, but it's an easy book. It's a really good book. And it talks about Amazon's journey and the values that they have. And what's interesting is obviously you're balancing here this level of empowerment, right? We have to empower our team members to really be able to do what we hired them to do, to be great at what they're great at. But at the same time, you cannot achieve that true level of customer value unless you empower them, because you will always create slow progress in the interim. And so Amazon has this principle that they call obsession with the customer. So you're not just customer driven or customer led, it's a genuine obsession, and that's their principle. And I've always, as soon as I heard that, it's always fascinated me, because I think it's just truly living what you do, even when it means making the hard decisions. But again, I think the line of what that teeters on is when you think about innovation and when we think about ownership and acting like owners as employees, those things together help us be able to bring maximum value to our customers.
I think that's a really good point, and you bring up a company that I really admire as a business person, but obviously, like most of us, and also a big customer of theirs, they are obsessed with the customer. And I'm guessing, while I've never worked at Amazon, so I'm taking a little bit of a leap here, But I'm guessing that doesn't mean an operating free-for-all, right? It means people who understand the mission, understand what their authorities are, reduce bureaucracy through that same understanding, and then deal with those exceptional cases where things do need adjudication, and unfortunately that involves bureaucracy.
Which is what you're referring to as the guideposts, right?
Absolutely.
I think of it like bowling. So I have a son who will be 4 this month, actually, and it's like bowling with the bumpers.
Yeah.
Right?
Bowling with the bumpers, I love
you
it,
can
yeah.
still actually get a gutter. I'm not going to talk about that, but it is possible to still get a gutter ball.
How would you know that,
You have
Jennifer?
to work hard.
I've seen other people do it. But in the midst of it, you've got guardrails, right? So your likelihood of getting a gutter or completely going off board, I mean, it has to be a really bad bowling ball
Are there any
throw.
videos of this? I just
One?
Can I see your phone?
No. We had to turn it off, Mike said.
It's true though that I like the goalpost too, because there is room within there to do what you need to do if you've been empowered by your superiors. You know where the borders are.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right, and look, I'm guessing that we're having this conversation today. If we were having this conversation a decade or two ago, it might be slightly different. But what we enjoy in all industries, certainly at Guidehouse, we enjoy working with incredibly talented young people, and it's not just the millennial generation. There's other generations working in a big complex business, but people have expectations around they're engaged, around how they are contributing to the organization. I can't imagine that the vast majority of my team, I'd have a hard time imagining any team, that would be satisfied in a working environment where you're simply told what to do, how to do it, when to show up, and if there's any tangential connection to your output and our strategy, it's incidental.
Sounds like a dream.
And that's just the antithesis of what people want. It's
right.
We talked last week about the Baldrige journey. There's a similar journey metaphor here in employee engagement and in the communications and understanding and distillation of strategy. Because even if you arrive at a place where everybody has perfect clarity into the strategy of the organization and their specific connection to that strategy, that understanding has a half-life. And and again, I go back to what Ben said earlier. It's not about just communication, but you've really got to make sure that people are constantly up to date, up to speed on what's changing and what their role is and how it matters. And once they have that, and I'll never be perfect at it. My leadership team's sensational. They'll never be perfect at it. Because our people, our teams who are just comprised of incredibly talented, really, really capable people who want to bring their A game routinely, they have high expectations, as they should. So we're constantly on a journey to inform and edify and engage, and I don't think that'll ever end.
Yeah. So let's pivot to that second key theme that came out of last week's radio show, and that was really what really matters from a quality standpoint is defined by customers. So let's unpack that a little bit, Scott. Give us some insights based on your experience and learnings that are relevant to that, and the process and diligence required to really hear the customer and really understand.
I remember that, and I'm happy to talk about it. It's funny, when we started our Baldrige journey, and we made the naive proclamation among our people that we were going to pursue the Baldrige Award. We were going to build a world-class quality platform and program. It was going to create sustainable and measurable quality improvement, engage our people. We really did not know what we were biting off, and that's maybe where naivete is helpful in undertaking something like this. But it's interesting. Our people and the teams that we operate with have been so engaged in every part of our journey, and continue to be engaged in our quality journey today. It's almost like you get to work with people you can put the business on autopilot, and that's a really big deal for me as a leader who gets the opportunity to work with these great people. But it's also a big responsibility to make sure that we are continuing to create a platform that is committed to ongoing improvement and quality improvement, and that's where the Baldrige framework comes in, and has served us so really well, Ben, in these past few years, and we think it's going to serve us well in the future.
So what are some of the approaches that you would recommend that the listeners consider as they're thinking about how to best engage their customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, when we embarked on this journey, I probably read this somewhere, but I don't remember where, so I can't give credit to whomever wrote it. But we came up with this concept that we can't define quality, that only the clients can.
Yeah.
And it actually sounds pretty wise, but it's also pretty obvious. But we learned very quickly, first of all, if we try to define quality ourselves, we will inevitably define it so that we can score a lot of points,
right?
Figuratively and literally, right? Clients demand that we have a sign above the door. There it is. It's above the door. We're in great shape. And I will tell you, in our quality journey, even though we were very committed to putting the client at the center of this framework, I think we still tended in the early years to nudge towards defining quality or defining the client's evaluation quality through our own lens, because it's easier.
Yeah.
There's less to improve when you're taking stock of everything that's going well. And that's if there's no other reason, then that's a great reason to start with, even if you need outside assistance in the form of third-party assessors and surveyors of quality and your client's perceptions of quality. And we did that from time to time. By stepping outside and insisting on an unvarnished perspective of the clients, you really create the right baseline and the right set of objectives, and that served us really well. And it really was. If I think about us becoming a high quality platform, it's hard for me to think of an insistence that was higher profile than that. The clients describe our quality, we don't. And that set us, that wasn't just a platitude or a philosophy. It set us down a very specific path of ensuring that we understood the clients, understood the voice of the customer, which we talked about last week briefly. That's really untaps a lot of value by going down that path. But it's harder, and it's more costly, and ultimately, though, we took stock of what we really learned and how we really improved through this Baldrige process. Ultimately, the voice of the customer was probably the thing that mattered most in impacting the broadest parts of our business, from investment to client-touching operations.
Yeah. So a colleague of mine used to call this lack of listening to customers as having a lip lock on our own exhaust pipe.
I like it. It's a good metaphor.
Right?
Wow.
Right? So it's like, hey, you have to be willing to look at things completely different, which is tough from a customer feedback standpoint.
I'd be remiss if I didn't relate this back to both healthcare and Baldrige, right? In healthcare, we talk a lot about this in the sense of, especially when it comes to being patient-centered, right? And how everything we aim to do is patient-centered, but the reality is it's not, or else consumerism wouldn't be in the world that we are today, to the extent that we are, and trying to bring about better access, more convenience, better quality, things of that nature. But the biggest thing that I've heard in terms of a struggle for organizations or even individuals who are pursuing Baldrige is really around the feedback report. From the first time you submit your application, you get back this feedback report that basically tells you, hey, here's what you're really great at, and hey, here's kind of what you stink at, right? And that's personal, because even if it's not targeted towards Jennifer, it might be targeted towards your company, and people pour their sweat, blood, and equity into, hopefully not blood, but maybe in healthcare.
Tears, maybe.
Tears, maybe that's a little better. But all of those things, right, into their business. And so it's very personal, no matter where you're at in your position. So being able to take that feedback, internalize it in a way that's healthy and promotes growth, as opposed to kind of curling up inside your shell.
That's a really good point, and I got to tell you, if there's organizations, and we'll stick to organizations since we're talking about the Baldrige feedback report, who've gone through this process. There's other ways to get feedback, of course, and reacting to bad feedback is always difficult. But for those who've gone through Baldrige, I think most go through it this way. You get that first feedback report, and I'm revealing my own insecurities here, but you get that first feedback report, and everything you see in it that is positive, that is glowing, that resonates to the things that you think you're really good at and ultimately strokes your ego, that's where you say the people who evaluated us got it right. They really understand us. And then you look at everything else and you say, these people, this is where they just didn't understand us.
Yeah, we must not have communicated effectively.
It's communication. Right. It's their lack of understanding of our industry.
They just don't know.
Every industry is unique.
They must not have seen that result.
You have to evolve beyond that. And admittedly, I remember vividly the day we sat down as a leadership team to read our first feedback report.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it pretty much, you think I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek, it pretty much went down those lines. Everything on this side of the column, they got right. Everything over here, they got wrong. And obviously, you have to move beyond that. And the quicker you can move beyond that, the quicker you can get to real quality. I will say this about the feedback report, though, and I've mentioned this in a number of settings, public and more private, in the latter case when we're acting as an advisor on quality programs. When you get the feedback report, a lot of Baldrige applicants are really, really focused on closing the gaps and winning the award. Mm-hmm. And I admire that. There's nothing wrong with that. We did it ourselves. But one thing we did that is a little bit different than some companies, when we looked at the feedback report and we finally matured our processes and our understanding enough to embrace the criticism, we didn't always go out and address every single item. Either substantially or cosmetically. There were certain things in later feedback reports that were constructive. We weren't dismissive of them, but we showed in the future evaluation why we didn't believe that mattered. It wasn't defensive, but we showed why that isn't imperative, but why something else is. And I had shared this a few weeks ago with a corporate audience on Baldrige and on improvement frameworks. And I said, if you get hung up on the exact wording of a piece of feedback, or you get hung up in the case of the Baldrige criteria, the framework, on the exact wording of the framework itself, you do miss an opportunity to improve because not everything is relevant, and certainly not everything is relevant in equal measure. And so you have to exercise some leadership judgment. But to do that, as the point was made, you've first got to be open to that criticism, and then you can interpret what really can move the needle in your corporate performance.
Yeah, so Scott, you said a couple of things. Again, they're really key that I want to emphasize. You embrace criticism, and you take a posture of not being defensive, but instead really analyzing the applicability and accuracy of it so that you can change.
And that, for human beings, is probably the hardest thing. I don't care who you are
I agree with you.
and what job you work. When you get that employee evaluation, and this is just this is just human nature. Someone can say, 99 people can say something great about you. It's the one person who has the criticism that gets in your head, right? And it's really hard, but it is so important.
That's the one you wake up thinking about.
Right.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left, and there's a related concept here to leadership and understanding the customer. It comes from that article that we talked about by Donald Sewell and Rebecca Humkes. They state in here, strategy execution, as we define the term, consists of seizing opportunities that support the strategy while coordinating with other parts of the organization on an ongoing basis. So this connection point between the clarity of strategy and effective leadership and really understanding what the customer wants has to do with what I would refer to as orchestration, right? In other words, how do you make sure that everybody's actually singing off the same chorus sheet and working collaboratively, not as independent cowboys, but in a really, really well executed, coordinated way where the strategy is informed by the customer, it's accurate, and you're able to pull that off. Thoughts on that, Scott? Because I know that's been a big part of what you've done.
Yeah, it's you said it really well, and that's what I enjoyed about our show last week is I was able to take notes on things I need to improve, and that's probably one of them. But one of the things that this Baldrige journey revealed for us, and this was, you go back to the comment on the feedback reports and being able to look in the mirror and take them as constructive feedback. One of the biggest things we had to improve was the integration of our strategy, development, and execution process with our budget formulation and evaluation process.
Yeah.
And we candidly, now this is going back a few years, my recollection was the inferior aspects of all those processes for us really had to do with their segmentation. We had a good strategy process, but it wasn't as linked as it should have been to budget or performance evaluation. And we had good processes in those other areas that were similarly not tightly linked. linking sort of the strategy process, the budget process, the investment process as part of the budget process, and of course, the evaluation process, the performance management piece. That is, if I think about the substance of what we were able to improve over a 6-7 year time frame in that journey, that's probably the biggest thing. And it underscores an important element for all quality improvement, whether you're using Baldrige or not, and that is optimizing one or a discrete number of processes, or worse yet, steps within a process, doesn't really improve your quality. In fact, some pundits might say it actually speeds up your demise because you're being more efficient at something you're not as good at. And that Baldrige forces you into a way more, I think the right word is holistic, a holistic perspective of how all these processes can work better together. And I don't know that anybody would espouse this, but to make the point, I believe you're better off with grading all of your processes at about a B minus level and having all of them at that level than having a few A processes and some C and D or worse yet, F processes, particularly where the last affects your clients directly. And that's a big learning in Baldrige, because some people go on and they want to undertake, and this is normal in any type of organization, we want to improve a process, which is great and it's noble. And if you're improving that process and it's got a direct impact on your customer, your profitability, or your risk, so be it. But don't ignore all the other processes that share touch points with customers or share data or impact that process. That was really difficult for us to get our heads around, and once we did, we unlocked a lot of value.
You're talking a lot about variation and reducing variation, so it's right up my alley with Six Sigma.
It's exactly, absolutely, and it borrows from theory of constraints as well, right? You have a great process right in the middle, you have a great step right in the middle of a bad process. That's to no gain.
Right. So I know we're right at our time, but just one quick question for you, based out of everything that you've learned over the years, your experience and your connection to Baldrige, what would you say is your personal biggest learning opportunity for you?
Yeah, I'll answer it this way quickly. I wish I had known when we started this project, and that's probably the biggest one. I think it is you lead as a project leader, whether you're the CEO or the other champion for quality. You find out how the quality improvement effort of Baldrige can impact everybody in their daily lives, and you make that the centerpiece of your initiative, because that not only serves you well for the project of pursuing Baldrige, it serves you well for the very important sustainment of it that we've talked about before.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways to begin, but that's the best way to begin. It took us a year or so to understand that, and that's something I would have put up front.
That's great. Thank you.
So, Scott, thank you a ton for being on both weeks' show. Very, very insightful. We know how busy you are with all of the M&A activity going on, and so that you carved out that time over a 2-week period, we really, really appreciate.
Truly my pleasure, anytime.
And best of luck going forward. And we want to thank everyone who listened to this Leader Dialogue, brought to you by Soar Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. We will see you next time. Please join us. Leader Dialogue here on Business Radio X.